panellists, and then what we'll do is I'll hand over first to Brett to talk, then to Mark, and then to Kerry. I'll ask you to hold your questions until the end. We will have a long time for discussion at the end. We'll take questions from the floor and we'll also take questions online. So please join me in welcoming all of our speakers and panellists, and then we'll hand straight over to Brett for his presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Caroline, and thanks so much for the invitation.
I can't hear you yet, Brett, but I'm sure we'll be able to soon.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me, Caroline?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Here I am.
Over to you.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to speak today. Fantastic to be here. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on Wurundjeri country here of the Kulin Nations in Naarm or Melbourne, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Also great to be on here with my good public health mates, Kerry and Mark. So I just wanted to speak briefly about crisis communication. I think it's a really central role that Chief Health Officers or equivalent have had across Australia and around the world. And it's something that's not an easy task, but it's a really valuable one, and it's a core part of the public health engagement as part of the response, control, stewardship through a crisis. And obviously, we've been through a once-in-a-century crisis, as we all know, and COVID-19 has really taught me a number of lessons, and I think there are a number of reflections globally around exactly what crisis communication has provided, what it's lacked, and maybe some of the tweaks we might make going forward. I think some of the most powerful lessons are that we have to be really upfront in a crisis. We have to bring our fully authentic selves into the space in talking about what we're confronted with and how we might manage through it. And that means the good, the bad and the ugly. That was the title of a story in Croaky News that I think was published very early in 2020. And I was reflecting on how I wanted to bring that component of my authenticity forward in my engagement with the community. And it means talking to, yes, the hope and the positive messaging that we have, but not to downplay the profundity of the challenges, the impossible decisions, the paradox of decision-making when there is no path of no harm. And that means talking to the nuance, talking to the complexity, acknowledging the difficulties in coming to the decisions that you make, acknowledging the collective trauma that people are going through. You know, it's overblown to talk about it in warlike terms, but it needs to have that sense of bringing everyone together on a really difficult journey, and that's why it sometimes has Churchillian tones, or people reflect on the way that Zelensky has talked about the challenges facing Ukraine and the way that he has done it. It's often been said that leaders talk about building a plane while flying it, or sailing a boat while building it, and it feels that way. It's a time of enormous uncertainty, and it's a time where we are needing to meet the needs of an entire population who are anxious, angry, and sometimes confused about exactly what they're facing and how it will play out. And so saying sorry for some of the poor decisions or some of the missteps that have happened along the way are also really important, I think. And Peter Sandman is someone I've referenced before, a one-time journalist, then did a PhD in risk communication, and he's a real master, I think, of the trade, has done a lot of analysis on what has worked and what has not worked in the risk communication space. His classic, and I think now reasonably globally famous equation is risk equals hazard plus outrage. And what he's talking about is risk, true risk, perceived risk, is a function of both hazard and the outrage that people experience around that hazard. And crisis communication, if you think of outrage on a vertical axis and and the hazard on a horizontal axis. Crisis communication is up in that quadrant where both the hazard is extremely high and the outrage, if you like, is really high. So people have legitimate, well-founded concerns about a really significant hazard. And the dimensions that he talks about in crisis communication are just those that I've referenced: honest, authentic, speaking to the complexity, not hiding, not oversimplifying, overselling or underselling anything. He's seen a lot of circumstances where public health, in particular, and with the best of intentions really, not with malice aforethought, but with the best of intentions, have sometimes bent the truth in order to get the behaviours that they know will be a benefit at a population level. And one example was CDC, and I think this was a misstep by them, saying that people didn't need to wear masks if they'd been vaccinated. I think it was in part based on facts that they were less likely to transmit or less likely to pick up infection, but it was at a time when pre-symptomatic and asymptomatic transmission was known. And so I think they were trying to increase vaccination uptake, but it basically sold a somewhat false story. And I think we need to be really cautious about doing so, A, because we'll be caught out, and B, because it just chips away at that trust and rapport that is so critical through crisis management. The other quadrant that he talks about is when the outrage is actually low, people are not particularly motivated, but the hazard remains high. I think we're kind of moving into a phase of that with COVID at the moment. People are arguing the point clearly, but there's a really substantial ongoing mortality. There is really substantial long COVID risk and post-COVID risk for other really significant illness, heart attack, sudden death, stroke, that will probably persist for years and will affect tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Australians. And so precautionary advocacy, again, don't bend the truth, but find ways, means, methods, emotional hooks, proper deep-seated engagement to make those facts manifestly apparent to people so that they can still engage in the behaviours, understanding the truth that we're faced with. And there's a real temptation, and global leaders around the world have probably oversimplified sometimes, been too dogmatic, been too absolutist. The pandemic is over is one of those examples. I think, again, it's an arguable point, but I would think that we are better served with talking through the complexity and the nuance about what that might mean. That the lay expression, the pandemic is over, does not meet everyone's needs in terms of a real understanding. We've got a significant challenge going ahead of us. We are back to a much, much more normal way of living, but we need to remain mindful of those ongoing impacts and the challenges before us. I also think, and having been substantially involved in social media communication, being on Twitter, that misinformation and disinformation is something that we've really failed to address properly. Yes, we try and correct with pushing out appropriate factual messaging, but governments often in the website pamphlet poster space when deep-seated engagement is actually what's needed. And Cambridge has done some work on a kind of inoculation against misinformation and disinformation. So letting people know how they are going to be confronted with information which is not correct, sometimes innocently not correct, but amplified, so misinformation, and sometimes with an actual tactical approach, disinformation to try and change people's minds and change people's approaches to the world. And we need to get in early, and there's a notion of pre-bunking with letting people know what they might be faced with, where they can go for appropriate information, and how they might buff it away, especially in their own social networks, which can really amplify both misinformation and disinformation. Social media is full of its echo chambers, and it lends itself to polarisation. People are not particularly comfortable with complexity and nuance at times, but I think we have to continue to fight that fight HL mentioned said, for every complex problem, there is a solution which is simple, clear, and wrong. Even though that's comical, it speaks to a truth that it is intellectually lazy and emotionally lazy to accept a narrative that is absolutist and really simple when the truth is complex. We've gone through phases and phases of this pandemic where the facts have changed significantly from time to time. Different variants of concern, different vaccine efficacy, and recently I spoke to the fact that the vaccines that we're using and the 3 and 4 doses that we've received have gone from being highly effective at stopping transmission to not particularly effective at all, but they remain very effective against severe illness, that direct protective effect. But even that wanes, and we've learned this, and it's actually changed, in fact, over time. And of course, there were the conspiracy theorists and the absolutists who said, oh, we were right all along, the vaccines have never worked. You just have to dive into that space and keep prosecuting the fact that circumstances change, the message has to change, and not oversimplify it in that regard. So for anyone who's thinking of public health practice, I think media training is a fantastic foundational piece, but practice is a really useful one. But the most important element of those 3 is bringing your unashamedly authentic self into the space and speaking to those complexities and nuances and sitting with the discomfort of being challenged left, right and centre in regard to that. Look, that's it from me. We'll talk about a load of other things and my colleagues will speak to different dimensions, no doubt, but thanks again for the opportunity.
That was